Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to answer a question about colorism that I got in my email. And what we're going to talk about I'm going to do this in two parts as much as possible because it's a subject that can go on and on and on. However, it's a very important subject to me and I feel very strongly about understanding it. So I'm going to talk to you first today about how our colors are not equal and how historically there is some reference to how there is some impact on how we see ourselves regarding our color, but also how people perceive us in the world and our opportunities based off of those perceptions. And so I am going to do this in a twofer. I'm going to give some historical context, and then hopefully if it doesn't run over too long, I am also going to then tell you how it has an extreme impact on the self-esteem and the self-image of women of color. And so let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about first, what is colorism? And so there are a number of definitions, and I'm not going to try to give you this perfected definition, but what I'm going to really kind of give you an idea of the fact that it's a basic idea and or internalized racism, which impacts both men and women regarding their complexion and the racial identity and identification within those complexions. And so in order to not get too convoluted in terms of with terms and different things, I'm going to stick to using the word colorism versus internalized racism, although there is some interchangeable language that could kind of play a part in how we see ourselves in perception. And so I'm going to just strictly say, for right now, our definition is going to be in the base, and this is very basic thinking of the impact of how color and how you perceive color impacts internalized racism and then ultimately impacts the community in which you live in. So the impact of colorism impacts both dark, light, brown skinned women and men. And what it does, it becomes really important for us to talk about it and be honest about it, regardless of our complexion. And so when I was thinking of doing this topic, I ran it past a few of the people in my life that I care about, and some of them felt strongly that it wasn't a subject that I should probably talk about, just based off of having my own bias and or feeling like people may not want to hear it from someone who may fall on what is considered a lighter skin complexion and have a perception that maybe discrimination isn't happening or going to happen. And so I'm going to make it very clear that I actually believe very deeply that colorism impacts our community in a lot of ways, both light and dark skinned people. However, I'm actually going to argue that dark-skinned women are the most impacted by colorism in terms of stereotypical views on attractiveness and the perception of beauty. And so because of that, I believe strongly that there are some opportunities that are given based off of having a lighter skinned individual versus a darker. And so I want to say that up front, get it out the way so that people can hear my views prior to me just having a discussion on the historical context of colorism. And so again, the definition, it can impact both men and women, and it is what I consider internalized racism that is based off of the complexions of our skin. And so some of the areas that are impacted are perceived attractiveness, mate selection and opportunity, symbols of negative connotation versus good connotation, what is considered good hair versus bad hair, what is considered beautiful versus not beautiful. So it does have a large impact on our esteem. And so I'm not going to get into esteem until the second video, but I want to make sure that we talk about colorism in a way that is honest and that it does have some historical basis. So I want to give some really quick historical, I guess you can say, information about colorism. So the reality is that colorism, like most things in America, when it comes to Black American culture, the negative indicators are rooted in historical enslavement, and it rooted in the enslavement and the opportunity and color gap that came along with slavery. And the color gap being that when Black Americans were enslaved, many of them were, and I'm trying to tread lightly, okay, many of them were raped and not given the freedoms to have a choice of who they would make a child with. And as a result, we have what was considered mixed race relationships, where the slave and the slave master would create a child, and then ultimately it created a color imbalance within our community. And a color discrepancy and imbalance ultimately became about privilege and power, and privilege and power being lighter versus darker skinned Africans in America. And so that's a very important factor when it comes to historical context of colorism, because we pretend as if we are so removed from a thinking that was developed in such a negative way, or a negative experience here in this country, because I'm specifically talking about colorism in America. And I want to make that preference I want to make that clear, because if we went historically into other colorism in other countries, then it is rooted in slavery, but then it also becomes other layers of whiteness and white supremacy. And so I don't want to get into that. I just want to strictly talk about right now how it is colorism has an impact on us currently in America, and the women of color are impacted by it, but especially darker skinned women have an impact. It has impacted differently because of this imbalance and discrepancy that came from historical privilege that really, it is sad, white supremacy created a privilege based off of mixed race relationships. And at the time, not currently, at the time, it was slave master, and it had an historical belief that lighter skin equates to being closer to whiter skin, which ultimately made them ultimately made them better because they weren't pure African. And so although people can argue, oh, well, colorism doesn't impact us, I don't have an issue with Black and or light versus darker skin, the reality is that historically it has been played out, regardless of if you individually have an issue or not, the impact is there. And as a result, it has impacted us as a community currently based off of that historical context. And so I really want us to kind of get an understanding that colorism is not just about what you currently see, but it does have some historical context that impacts why colorism is happening and continues to happen, but also where it came from, and how if we don't acknowledge something the same way as a community, we need people and white supremacy tries to downplay the severity of slavery. It's important for us not to downplay it as a community, and also understand how it has impacted even us within our culture. Excuse me. Didn't like my hair sitting on that one side. Anyway, and so the legacy of slavery and enslavement of a people has created what we see in terms of our complexions as closer to a whiter shade being positive, and a darker shade being more African-based complexion, and or pure African being a negative. And so as a result, subconsciously, it created colorism in its sense that it made an imbalance that says, hey, the lighter you are, the better you are. The darker you are, the worse you are. And then as we move through history, just in general in this country, I'm speaking American history, as we move through, there is some harsh realities that came along with having fairer skin. And one of those harsh realities were that you were treated differently, and you were seen to be better suited to be in the house, and a darker skinned person was better suited to be in the field. And I always laugh when people use the references as if it makes you blacker to be one or the other. But the reality is that it was all slavery, and it was all enslavement, which means that ultimately it was enslaving your body and your mind, and it was creating damaging realities that would last for generations and still last to this day, that says that, you know, I'm either a field worker or a house worker, and indicating that one was better than the other when they both were enslavements, and there may have been opportunities that looked better, but they were still not in control of their bodies or their mind and freedoms. And so, however, what it did though, because I also want to, I'm playing both sides of the fence here, but I also want to be very clear that what it did though is also it created a distance within our community that said, you're getting more benefits because you're an offspring of a white man. And as a result, you get what is considered basic education, you get more, you're afforded more opportunities. And this is happening during slavery. And so, yes, it creates an imbalance within the group that creates a form of self-hatred towards each other. But also what privilege does, and it naturally, what privilege does is it makes you comfortable, and it makes you acknowledge your differences as something good. And so even some of our fairer skinned people, and historically this is just true, have profited off of their complexion at the time in order to advance and get opportunities. And so the sad thing about privilege is that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, where it becomes, are you not supposed to accept a privilege? I agree that you accept it, but you also need to acknowledge that those opportunities are as a result of your privilege, and that other people are not privileged because of that. And so during the time, there was an increase in education amongst lighter skinned people. There was an actual increase. And then when we go quickly speeding up from slavery to even like after sharecropping and all those things, and going into like civil rights and stuff, there is the reality that in terms of division and dividing, there are some lighter skinned African American or Black American stories that indicated a clear separation and a clear division to be able to identify them as different than their darker skinned brothers. And I'm not going to get into if that was right or wrong, if it was an issue of exclusion versus a civic duty in their mind to try to create a community or culture, but it also is how we have foundations or organizations that still to this day exist, and that's a whole nother story, based in the thinking that we have to do something different and we have to give ourselves opportunity. And I am far from saying that this makes anyone good or bad, excuse me. I'm just telling you history, like just to be 100. And so the reason why I wanted to start with this versus just going straight into a video on how colorism impacts our self-esteem is because I really feel like it's important for us to know historically, even if you don't agree with it currently in your life and you're doing everything in your power to make sure that all of us are equally beautiful, seen as beautiful, and you're breaking down layers of discrimination amongst all levels of color, even if you're doing all of those things, the reality of power and privilege, it still plays out behind the scene, whether you like it or not. And if we don't bring stuff to the forefront, we are never going to really deal with it. Anyway, get off my soapbox. Sorry. So fast forward, because I want to talk about discrimination as well a little bit. And I'm gonna probably end this video specifically, which is about how we are not equal in terms of historical reference and color in this country, and how colorism is real. And if we don't do something to address it, and all of us do something to address it, it will continue to breed its ugly head in our culture. And internalized racism is a beast that has been holding us back on so many different levels. So yeah, okay. So let's talk about discrimination. Both light and darker skin, there is research beyond research, and maybe I'll link some titles and some different things that you can look into in terms of some research related to darker skin versus lighter skin studies. And a lot of the studies, sadly, only looked at it from heterosexual, which is a whole nother level of power and privilege, which heterosexual perspective, when they also don't look at any other in terms of the relationship and attractiveness and perception of attractiveness in relationships. And so when I talk about how it impacts our esteem, we'll come back to that specifically. But when we just think about the basis of discrimination, when we think of old terminologies like good or bad hair, and how even if you aren't participating, I'm trying really hard because I feel like everybody is walking this like line of I'm not doing that, so it doesn't happen. But the reality is that many of us have participated in things like good or bad hair comments. Oh, your hair is too nappy or too kinky. You've said things that you don't ignore, or light bright, or you I can't think of some of the negatives that are said, just like passing, like general. Oh, you too dark skinned, or you better get out that sun because you're getting really dark. Don't get any browner than that. Nobody's gonna like you. Certain statements have been made, and they're made so lightly that you don't even acknowledge that they're based in a form of hatred and discrimination amongst our own group that is really about a lighter or dark skinned person. And like some of the stuff that I see when we're talking about these celebrities, like the whole like Carly B and the young lady who was who's always in a beef with somebody, I can't think of her, Azila Banks, whatever her name is. When we talk about how we played that out, even if you didn't agree with the Banks girl in terms of her statements and what she would say, because sometimes she gets reckless out the mouth. I definitely don't think that she's like the best person to represent a group in terms of some of the things she says. But I also think that there was some clear lines that were blurred based off of what we would accept from the quote unquote Carly B, who's lighter skinned, and when the way she used the N-word and all, like there's a layers of stuff that we don't really like to discuss, but it's playing out. And working with adolescents and hearing the stuff that they still say to each other very clearly about, oh, that light skinned girl, or she only rocks with such and such because of that, because she's lighter. You'll be surprised at some of the layers that are still happening. Anyway, so discrimination. See, I'm getting on my soapbox and I get on it. Like, it's hard to come on. Good hair versus bad hair are some examples. Lighter versus darker skin just being seen as viewed as better than others, and actually declaring or giving privilege to people based off of that complexion. So having like arguments or fights in the play yard. Like, so I'm trying to think of some of the stuff that people would say. It was so hateful. And I'm sure I may have said some of the stuff myself when I was younger, because that's what kids do. But part of what kids do is that they learn it subconsciously from the world they're participating in, which is what they're watching, what they're hearing, what they're seeing. All of those things are playing a part into how we're actually discriminating against each other. There is historical references and context that puts us in this position to do so. And I am not going to go any further because I'm about to get into self-worth and self-esteem, but I really want us to really just kind of realize that if we are going to acknowledge that as a people, we are coming and moving forward towards loving ourselves and loving all shades and all complexions of ourselves, we have to acknowledge the root issues that come along with colorism, very similar to white supremacy, acknowledging what slavery and racism and sexism and patriarch behavior has done in our society currently, and how it ultimately impacts us, whether we like it or not. We have to acknowledge it and to start having discussions about how to change it and how to make sure that we are sending clear messages to all of our babies, regardless of their hair texture, regardless of their complexion, regardless of their education level, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of anything that makes them up, that makes them different or look different. It becomes important for us to start to nurture those things both consciously and subconsciously. All right. You guys, this video is a little bit of rambling, but because it is really the historical context related to colorism. And I wanted to give that before I go into how colorism is impacting our self-image. And that will be next week. All right, you guys, be well.